Long before anyone thought to carve words into clay, there were no books, no letters, and no alphabets. In the ancient land of Mesopotamia, a vast and fertile plain nestled between two great rivers called the Tigris and the Euphrates, humanity was taking its first steps toward building cities. Life was changing very fast. People had discovered how to farm the land, how to irrigate crops, and how to domesticate animals. This agricultural revolution meant that for the first time in history, not every single person had to spend all day searching for food. Some people could become potters, weavers, or builders. Villages grew into large, bustling urban centers, the first cities the world had ever seen. One of these cities was called Uruk, and it was a true metropolis of the ancient world. It was filled with thousands of people, towering temples called ziggurats, and busy marketplaces. With so many people living together, trading goods, and storing grain, a massive problem began to emerge. The human brain simply could not keep track of everything anymore. A temple priest, who was in charge of collecting offerings of barley and wheat, needed to know how much grain a farmer had promised versus how much he actually delivered. A merchant sending a shipment of clay pots down the river needed a way to prove that all the pots were accounted for when they arrived at their destination. They needed a system that was more reliable than a messenger's memory. At first, people used a very simple method of accounting. They would take a lump of soft clay and shape it into a small, hollow ball. Inside this clay envelope, they would place tiny tokens made of clay, each shaped differently. For example, a cone-shaped token might represent a measure of barley, while a marble-shaped token might represent a single goat. When a deal was made, they baked the clay ball shut. If there was ever a dispute, you could break the ball open and count the tokens to see exactly what was promised. It was a clever system, an external memory device. But there was an obvious flaw. What if you wanted to check the contents without smashing the contract into dust? The answer to that problem would not just change record-keeping, it would change the entire human mind. The solution was a simple, yet profound invention. They began to press the tokens into the outside of the clay ball before sealing it, creating a permanent picture of the agreement for all to see. The clever practice of sealing tokens inside clay balls and then pressing their shapes on the outside solved the immediate problem of trust, but it also triggered a massive leap in thinking. It did not take long for the ancient accountants of Sumer to realize something revolutionary. If you could simply press the shape of a token into the soft clay to represent a goat or a jar of oil, why bother making the physical tokens in the first place? The clay envelope was completely unnecessary. You could just flatten a piece of wet clay into a small, pillow-shaped tablet and draw the picture directly onto the surface. This was the moment that the physical object became an abstract symbol, and it is the true beginning of what we can call proto-writing. This shift happened around 3,500 years before the Common Era. The earliest tablets that archaeologists have discovered are not filled with poetry or stories about kings. They are, quite frankly, very boring to read. They are inventories and receipts. A typical tablet from this period would look like a small, flat rectangle with simple pictures scratched into it. There might be a picture of a cow's head, followed by 5 round impressions, meaning 5 cattle. There might be a stalk of wheat, followed by a number. These signs were heavily pictographic, meaning they looked exactly like the object they represented. If you wanted to write down the word for bird, you drew a bird. If you wanted to write water, you drew 2 wavy lines that looked like a flowing stream. However, drawing on wet clay with a sharpened reed was not like painting on a cave wall. Clay is sticky and thick. When you try to draw a curve or a circle, the stylus tends to drag and create a messy, jagged line. The ancient scribes solved this problem by breaking down their pictures into a series of straight lines. They stopped drawing a full cow, they just drew the most recognizable feature, the triangular head. This process of simplification was critical. The images were no longer artistic masterpieces, they were functional symbols, quick to produce and easy to recognize. But the most monumental change came when these symbols stopped representing just physical things and started representing sounds. A picture of an arrow might have meant arrow, but the Sumerian word for arrow was ti. And ti also happened to be the word for life. Suddenly, a picture of a sharp weapon could be carved into clay to represent the abstract concept of living. The door to true writing had just swung wide open. To understand the look of this ancient script, you have to understand the tool that created it. In school, we learn to write with a pen that flows smoothly across paper. The Sumerian scribes, however, worked with a stubborn material and a primitive pen, and this combination dictated the entire visual style of their writing system. Their paper was the mud of the riverbank, an infinite and practically free resource that covered the landscape of Mesopotamia. Their pen was a reed, a tall, rigid grass that grew in the marshes. A fresh reed has a soft, spongy interior and a hard outer skin. The scribe would cut a piece of reed and chew on the end or shave it down so that it wasn't a point, but a wedge-shaped tip. It is this wedge shape that gives the writing system its modern name, cuneiform. The word comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. If you look at a piece of cuneiform writing, you will not see the flowing, connected curves of Arabic script or the sharp, straight lines of Latin letters. You will see a universe of tiny, tidy wedges arranged in intricate patterns. The technique was simple but required great skill. The scribe would hold the clay tablet in one hand and the reed stylus in the other. He would press the corner of the wedge tip into the clay at a steep angle and drag it slightly, creating a mark that looked like a small triangle with a tail. By varying the depth, the length, and the angle of the impression, different-looking wedges were made. There was a logic to this clay-based literacy. Unlike papyrus or parchment, clay is nearly indestructible, but only if you set it on fire. A conqueror might burn a city down, turning all the wooden roofs and woolen carpets to ash. But in doing so, he was essentially operating a giant, accidental kiln. The clay tablets stored in the burning libraries would be baked into terracotta, becoming ceramic pages that could last for tens of thousands of years without fading. This is a crucial reason why we know so much about ancient Mesopotamia but so little about other early civilizations who wrote on perishable materials. The scribe's job was monotonous but prestigious. He had to constantly keep the clay moist, storing it in a jar of water. He had to cut his reeds constantly as they wore down. He was not just a writer, he was a technician of mud, transforming dirt from the river into eternalized records that would outlast the very empires that created them. For nearly 2,000 years, these wedge-shaped signs were a complete mystery to humanity. Travelers crossing the dusty plains of what is now Iraq would see massive hills and the rubble of ancient ziggurats, and sometimes they would find small clay objects covered in strange scratches. They looked like the tracks left by birds walking across wet sand. No one on earth could read them. Scholars knew these must be the ruins of great civilizations mentioned in the Bible and in the histories of the Greeks, such as Nineveh and Babylon, but the voices of these cities were utterly silent. The journey to bring those voices back to life is a story of pure intellectual detective work, a race against time by brilliant men who gambled their reputations to crack an unbreakable code. The first big breakthrough came when a German schoolteacher named George Friedrich Grotefend decided to tackle the problem, not by digging, but by logic. He was looking at copies of inscriptions from a palace in Persepolis. He noticed that the strange wedges sometimes appeared in 3 different sets, as if the same text was written in 3 different scripts. He guessed, correctly, that one of these scripts was an old form of Persian. He knew the names of the Persian kings from Greek histories. He looked for a repeating pattern of wedges that might represent a king's title. He slowly identified the script for Xerxes, Darius, and Hystaspes. It was a fantastic start, but Grotefend could not go much further. The deeper secrets remained locked away. The final, dramatic climax came high on a cliff face in western Iran. There, a British Army officer named Henry Rawlinson, a man with a passion for languages and a fearlessness bordering on madness, risked his life to copy a massive inscription known as the Behistun inscription. This was the Rosetta Stone of Cuneiform. It was carved hundreds of feet up a sheer rock face, commissioned by King Darius the Great. Rawlinson dangled from ropes, standing on narrow ledges, making papier-mâché casts of the text. He deciphered the Old Persian part first, the same way Grotefend had, and then, using it as a dictionary, he began to attack the mysterious second script, which was Babylonian cuneiform. He discovered it was a syllabary, a system where each sign represented a syllable, not just an alphabet letter. By the 1850s, the lock had been picked. Clay tablets that had been silent since the age of the pharaohs began to speak, flooding the modern world with the voices of poets, accountants, and kings who had lived 4 millennia ago. When Henry Rawlinson and his fellow scholars finally unlocked the code, they discovered that cuneiform was not a simple alphabet like the one we use for English. It was something far more complex and far more ancient. It was a script that had evolved over 3,000 years, and its logic was a patchwork of the oldest picture writing and the most advanced phonetic concepts. To a modern reader, a letter like the letter B does not really mean anything by its shape. It is just an arbitrary sound. But in cuneiform, almost every sign had a history that stretched back to a literal drawing, and this created a system with multiple layers of meaning. A single wedge sign could drive a scholar mad because it could do 3 different jobs depending on how it was used. Firstly, a sign could be used as a logogram. This is the oldest function. A logogram is a single sign that represents an entire word. For example, the picture of a mountain represented the word for mountain, which in Sumerian was kur. Secondly, the same sign could be used as a phonogram, representing just the sound of the word. Because the word for mountain was kur, the scribe could use that mountain sign whenever he needed to write the syllable kur in a completely different word, like in a verb or a person's name. This is called the rebus principle, and it is exactly like writing the English word belief by drawing a picture of a bee and a leaf. The meaning of the bee and the leaf is irrelevant, only the sounds matter. Finally, to make things even more confusing but incredibly precise, the scribes invented determinatives. These were special signs that had no spoken sound at all. They were silent guides for the eye. A determinative was placed before or after a word to tell the reader what category it belonged to. For instance, the name of a god was always preceded by a star-shaped sign. Without moving your lips, you knew the next word was divine. A city name was preceded by a sign that looked like a crossroads. Place names, wooden objects, professions, and even types of birds had their own unpronounced markers. This was essential because cuneiform had a massive number of signs, and many of them shared the same sounds. The determinatives were like little whispers from the scribe to the reader, clarifying the intent and removing ambiguity from the text. This layered system allowed cuneiform to adapt perfectly to different languages, making it the world's first international script, used for Sumerian, Akkadian, Hittite, and many others. Learning to master this complex system of wedges was not something that could be done casually at home. It was a rigorous, full-time profession that required years of brutal schooling. The institution where this happened was called the Aduba, which literally translates from Sumerian as the House of Tablets. This was the world's first school system, a strict academy where young boys, and occasionally a few girls of the extreme elite, were sent to be transformed from careless children into disciplined scribes. The Adaba was a place of high ceilings and dusty corners, filled with the constant murmur of voices repeating lists and the scratch of reeds digging into soft clay. It was a place of fear, respect, and immense intellectual achievement. A boy did not enter the Adaba lightly. He usually came from a wealthy family, a son of a merchant, a priest, or a current scribe. On his first day, he carried a small offering for his teacher, a loaf of bread or a small amount of silver. Once inside, there were no stories or creative writing assignments. The Sumerian curriculum was based entirely on rote memorization. The young student began by kneading the clay, learning to make a flawless, flat tablet without air bubbles that would explode in the kiln. He learned to cut his reed correctly. Then, day after day, month after month, he copied lists. These were not exciting lists, they were thesauruses. Long lists of gods' names, lists of animals, lists of professions, and lists of legal phrases. He would write the word for pig so many times that the shape of the wedge became muscle memory in his fingers. Discipline was the core of the Adaba. The headmaster was a strict figure known as the father of the tablet house, and his assistants were the big brothers. If a student's hand slipped, if the tablet was sloppy, if he spoke out of turn, or worse, if he arrived late because he had been loitering in the streets, the punishment was swift and physical. A cane was used on the knuckles or the back. One ancient tablet contains the words of a student begging his father to invite the teacher to dinner and to provide him with gifts, essentially bribing the teacher so that he would stop beating the boy for his mistakes. However, the goal was not just to create human copying machines. At the advanced levels, the students finally got to copy the great hymns and myths. They learned the sacred Sumerian language even though it had become a dead language by the time they were learning it, much like Latin was for medieval scholars. By the time a young man graduated, he was a master of over 600 signs, a keeper of the cosmic order, and a man who would never have to get his hands dirty working in the irrigation ditches like the common folk. He had escaped manual labor through the power of mud. While the script was invented by accountants to count sheep and measure grain, it almost instantly became the property of the gods. In the ancient Mesopotamian worldview, humans were created for one single purpose, to be the servants of the divine. The gods owned the land, the water, and the sky. They were powerful, capricious beings who could flood the earth or withhold the rains on a whim. The only way to keep the world safe and operational was to keep the gods happy, and this required an incredibly complex system of rituals, offerings, and prayers. Cuneiform became the technology that managed this celestial bureaucracy. The temple, with its towering ziggurat stairway reaching for the heavens, became a business office run by priests who were essentially divine accountants. The priests used writing to ensure that the gods never went hungry or homeless. A temple dedicated to the god Enlil, the Lord of the Wind, was not just a church, it was a massive economic estate. It owned vast fields, herds of cattle, flocks of sheep, and employed thousands of workers, from weavers to bakers. All of this needed to be managed. The scribe priests would draw up contracts for farmers who rented the Holy Land, documenting exactly how much barley was owed. They would record the daily sacrifices, noting down on a tablet how many loaves of bread and how many jugs of beer were placed before the statue of the deity. If a king donated a golden sword to the temple, the scribe would inscribe the sword and carve a tablet recording the gift. If this inventory was not kept, the god might get less food than yesterday, and this could trigger divine anger. Meticulous writing was an act of piety, a balanced ledger was a bulwark against chaos. But the most profound use of writing in the temple was to map the destiny of the world. The priests looked to the stars, and they saw the writing of the gods in the sky. They meticulously recorded the movements of the planets, the phases of the moon, and strange omens. Did a two-headed calf just get born on the outskirts of the city? A scribe would be summoned to record the event in an omen compendium, and a fortune-teller would read the text to discover what it meant. They believed that the divine will was written down, and if you could just learn to read the signs in the liver of a sacrificial sheep or the flight of a bird, you could read the future. To have a library of omens written in cuneiform was to possess a secret manual for life. It was the password to the VIP back room of the universe, where everything, even disaster, was part of a written plan that the gods had scribbled down long ago. As the city-states of Sumer grew into vast empires like that of Akkad and later Babylon, the power of the written word took on a new, sharper edge. Writing was no longer just a tool for the accountant or a prayer for the priest, it became the physical embodiment of the king's absolute authority. The spoken word of a monarch was powerful, but it was temporary. A royal command written into clay became permanent and unchangeable. It could be copied and sent to governors in distant provinces. It could survive the king's own death. Cuneiform allowed the law to take on a physical body, a cold, hard object that could not be argued with or forgotten. The most famous example of this is a tall black stone monument known as the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was a king of Babylon who ruled over 3,700 years ago. He did not invent law, but he understood the theater of justice and the terrifying power of public writing. At the top of his monumental stele, there is a carved image showing Hammurabi receiving the symbols of law, a measuring rod and a coiled rope, directly from Shamash, the god of the sun and justice. The image is clear, this is not Hammurabi's opinion, it is divine truth. Below this image, covering the entire pillar, are rows and rows of dense, meticulously carved cuneiform signs. This is the law code, a list of nearly 300 decisions covering family life, property, and commerce. It is written in the classic, if-then, format, a conditional logic that sounds almost like computer programming. If a man has stolen an ox, then he must pay back 30 times its value. If a builder builds a house and it collapses killing the owner, then the builder shall be put to death. Putting the law on a massive public monument changed how society functioned. It was meant to be seen. The prologue to the code explicitly says that it was erected so that any man who felt he had been wronged could come before the statue of the King of Justice and have the laws read aloud to him. This was the principle of publicity. A corrupt judge could not easily twist a law that was literally carved in stone in the public square. It created a standard, a sense that society was governed by a set of fixed rules rather than the whims of a powerful man. Of course, life in Babylon was never truly equal. The code famously divides society into free men, dependent men, and slaves, with different punishments for each. But the concept that the king himself was bound by the writing was a revolutionary seed. The clay nail and the stone monument became the ultimate weapons of the throne. An empire was not just conquered by the sword, it was held together by the wedge. If the administrative texts and legal codes were the bones of cuneiform civilization, the literature was its beating heart. The script that began with counting goats eventually gave birth to soaring poetry that confronts the biggest questions of human existence: love, death, friendship, and the search for immortality. For centuries, these stories were locked away under mounds of sand, until Victorian archaeologists began pulling out fragments of tablets from the ruins of a king's library in the city of Nineveh. This was the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Assyrian Empire. He was a ruthless warlord who boasted of flaying his enemies, but he was also a scholar who sent agents across the empire to confiscate and copy every tablet they could find. His library held the secrets of the universe. When the boxes of jumbled clay fragments arrived at the British Museum, they were a nightmare puzzle. A brilliant young curator named George Smith was tasked with cleaning and sorting them. He was a self-taught expert in cuneiform, and one day, as he held a dusty fragment in his hand, he began to read the lines and his body went rigid with shock. He recognized a story about a great flood. A god named Ea warns a man named Utnapishtim to tear down his house of reeds and build a massive boat, a cubical ark, because a deluge was coming to wipe out mankind. Utnapishtim loads the boat with his family, the animals, and the craftsmen. The storm rages, the gods cower in fear, and the boat lodges on a mountain. George Smith read of the release of a dove and a raven to find dry land. It was a flood story that predated the biblical story of Noah by over 1,000 years. This was the Epic of Gilgamesh, the crown jewel of cuneiform literature. The flood story was just one chapter in a larger, profound tale. Gilgamesh was a king of Uruk, part god and part man, who was too powerful, arrogant, and restless. The gods created a wild man, Enkidu, to challenge him. After a fierce wrestling match, they become soulmates. Together, they journey to a cedar forest and slay a monster demon, Humbaba. But when Enkidu dies tragically from a wasting sickness, the great king Gilgamesh is broken by the terror of his own mortality. He abandons his kingdom and wanders the wilderness dressed in animal skins, searching for the secret of eternal life. He crosses poisonous waters and walks through a tunnel under the mountains at the edge of the world to find the one man who cheated death, the flood survivor Utnapishtim. But in the end, the secret is that immortality is reserved for the gods. The destiny of a king is to live fully, to enjoy the love of a child, the taste of beer, and the smell of fresh bread. The epic ends not with a victory over death, but with Gilgamesh looking at the mighty walls of his city, understanding that civilization itself, built by human hands, is his legacy. A hero's story, written in mud, taught us that mortality is what makes us human. For over 3,000 years, the wedge-shaped script dominated the Near East. It witnessed the rise of the Sumerians, the might of the Akkadian Empire, the splendor of Babylon, and the ferocity of Assyria. It was used to write love letters and death warrants, to record epic poems and receipts for laundry. It was the operating system for the earliest complex societies. But no technology, no matter how revolutionary, lasts forever. The very features that made cuneiform so durable also made it ripe for replacement. It was a victim of its own complexity, and it melted away under the bright, hot sun of a new, simpler alphabet that spread like wildfire across the Mediterranean world, brought by traders from the land of Phoenicia. The alphabet that the Phoenicians and later the Greeks used was a beautifully simple tool. Where a cuneiform scribe needed to memorize 600 different signs to write a poem, a Greek student only needed about 24. Writing was no longer a guarded mystery reserved for a closed class of initiates who had survived the brutal beatings of the Adaba. A merchant or a farmer could learn to read and write without dedicating a decade of his life. Cuneiform was also practically chained to the clay tablet, a heavy and bulky medium. You could not carry a library of clay tablets on a trading ship. Papyrus scrolls and parchment, written with the flowing Aramaic alphabet, were light, portable, and fast. The great empires of Mesopotamia fell, conquered by Persians, then by the Greeks under Alexander the Great. The conquerors had no use for the old, difficult script of the conquered. The Adaba schools slowly emptied. The voice of the stylus on wet clay grew fainter and fainter. The last known cuneiform tablet that we know of is an astronomical diary written in the year 75 of the Common Era. It is a dry, technical calculation of the moon and planets, devoid of the epic emotions of Gilgamesh. By this point, the wedge was a ghost. The knowledge of how to read the bird tracks on the clay simply evaporated from human memory for nearly 2,000 years. The temples of Sumer crumbled into dust, and the wind blew over the empty ruins. But the clay was patient. It held its secrets in the dark earth, waiting for the day when a new breed of scribes, the archaeologists and linguists, would come to give the mute past a voice again. The invention of writing in the land between the rivers is the story of how we became a species that can cheat death, not by living forever, but by sending our thoughts across 10,000 years. Next time you jot down a shopping list or sign a contract, you are holding a stylus made of light and pressing it into the soft clay of the future. The wedge never truly disappeared, it just evolved into every word you have ever read.